Hi, I'm Carolyn Sheridan, Executive Director and founder of Ag Health and Safety Alliance. And today I'm presenting information on the Respiratory Protection Standard. It may sound a little crazy, but I do like the Respiratory Protection Standard. I've spent a lot of my career as a registered nurse talking to people about respiratory protection, respirator fit testing. So this is something that I'm happy to talk to you about today. I really wish I could see all of you in person because I know that this is a lot of how we learn right now, but actually it's a lot more fun to see someone in person. So I'll do my best to make this Respiratory Protection Standard exciting for you. So we're going to get started and just review the basic Respiratory Protection Standard, which requires employers to establish and maintain a respiratory program to protect their respirators, the employees that are wearing respirators. Also, I'm just going to say right up front, as we move through these slides, I may misspeak. It may not be as smooth as I would like it to be, but maybe that adds a little bit of entertainment to what otherwise would be a dry topic. So the U.S. Occupational Safety and Hazard Administration, which is OSHA, is really responsible for ensuring this safe workplace for employees. And we know millions of workers are required to wear respirators in lots of different workplaces throughout the United States. I'm going to tell you that I work mostly with the agricultural population. I've done some work with industry and the poultry industry, as well as just regular different types of industry locally. Would be like milling work or maybe people who are welding. So I know that respirators protect workers from insufficient oxygen environments, harmful dust, fog, smokes, mist, gases, vapors, and sprays. And so respirators really need to provide protection only when they are properly selected in compliance with this respiratory protection standard. That's what this whole presentation is about, as long as the program that goes with it. So we're going to go ahead and talk a little bit more in detail about different aspects of this standard. So if you haven't been out there and looked at OSHA's respiratory protection standard, I'll tell you that OSHA's done a better job over the last several years of making their website easier to follow, easier to find things. So if you go to OSHA.gov, you would look for the 29 CFR 1910.134. This is a great screenshot of showing you where to search and where you would go to get different regulations. You can search from A to Z. So take a look out there if you've got some time. But we're going to talk very specifically about the key requirements of the Respiratory Protection Standard. And there's several aspects of it, and we're going to walk through each one of the aspects, some of them in just a little bit more detail. There's also a really great poster that I found, and I made this presentation so you can click through to these links to find a little bit more information than what I'm able to present in the short time that I'm with you today. So we're going to start by walking through these key requirements and figure out who does what. So there's a lot of requirements in the Respiratory Protection Program, which we're talking about right now. And not everybody does everything. We all have different skill sets. It's really related to our scope of practice. As a registered nurse, I can do quite a bit of the Respiratory Protection Program, but there's some pieces of it that I can't do, including the things that you can do, which is a hazard identification and risk assessment. So I rely on the information that you can gather in that hazard assessment or risk assessment to make sure I'm doing a good job when I help people set up their respiratory protection program. So we'll talk a little bit more about those roles and responsibilities as we move through this. This is also a resource that I'll show you at the end of the presentation and how to get to that talks through roles and responsibilities specifically for fit testing, which also is kind of a complicated thing that we want to make sure that people are learning. So what about those requirements? Okay, number one, a written program with policies and procedures. And this link at the top, this Respiratory Protection Program, is one of my favorites. It's actually from Minnesota Department of Public Health, because it's a very clear website that has nice links that take you to different templates. It talks through how this protection program works and what different responsibilities are. And also in Canvas, I believe that there's going to be some respiratory protection program templates, and those will be nice for you to take a look at as well. And one of the requirements also is we need to have a program administrator. We need to make sure that all aspects of this respiratory protection program are in place. And the best way to do that really is to have one person that understands what that means and make sure all of the requirements are being met. Now that can be different for each industry that a person is working with. It can be different in healthcare, and it can be different in agriculture as well, which is what I've mainly worked with. So also a requirement is the hazard identification and risk assessment. And this is where you, as industrial hygienists, play a really key role, because we want to make sure that the right respiratory protection measurements and equipment are used. We want to identify the potential health risks to workers and measure those exposure levels to see if they're acceptable or not. And then we develop a plan to control unacceptable exposure limits. So what we know is there's different ways to have respiratory hazard assessment, and there's certification forms to say that we've done that. And so there's lots of air quality testing that goes into place to make sure that we really have provided someone with the right kind of respirator for the job, and that it's going to provide the kind of protection that we want to protect those employees. We also know that there's a lot of occupational exposures. And the CDC has a really good website that talks about respiratory health at work. This is also a clickable link in the PowerPoint that you'll be getting. And we know that many of these different exposures require different types of respirators, because they come in all different forms, and the type and severity of the respiratory illness or disease depends on the type of work being performed during the inhalation when we're on the job, the type of substances that is inhaled, how long that they're in that work environment, and the location. And where that substance will end in their lungs, and of course that depends on the type of exposure that they're having. So really understanding occupational exposures is critical to making sure we're doing a good job of protecting the individuals that this standard and this respiratory protection program is really designed to do. There's another requirement of this respiratory protection standard, the program, and that's selection of respirators. Now, in week 15, there'll be more discussion about the different types of respirators, so I'm not going to go into detail about that right now, but we do know selection of respirators follows. It's based on the respiratory hazards. We need to know what those are. Make sure we know people are only using NIOSH certified respirators. And then we also know that we need to select from different models and sizes so it properly fits the employee. And we talk about that more in detail when we talk about respirator fit testing in week 15. And if exposures can't be identified, then we're going to assume that maybe it's considered immediately dangerous to life and health. Now, there are different types of respirators, from air purifying, supplied air, and self-contained breathing apparatuses. And we'll go into more detail about that when we discuss respirators. So when we talk about respiratory exposures, because agriculture is my passion, and I do know that this is a perfect example of an industry or an occupation where there's some very specific exposures, and many people involved in agriculture do have to be part of a respiratory program. Some do not. They only have to do pieces of it. But these are a couple of resources that are clickable for you if you're interested in agriculture and different ways to protect that population. So this is a good example of how healthcare providers, industrial hygienists, and many people who are involved in the agricultural health and safety world are trying really hard to provide adequate and appropriate respiratory protection. And one of the ways is to understand labels, whether it's a chemical, pesticide exposure, reading the label. But in many industries, not just agriculture, labels are key in assisting with determining which kind of a respirator should be used, what kind of a cartridge should be used. So that's also an important part of this respiratory protection program. Another requirement is the medical evaluation. So medical evaluation follows the OSHA standard, and there's an excellent resource that's clickable for you here as well. It's called the OSHA info sheet, and it talks about what evaluation of the employee's health, how to do that to make sure they can wear the respirator, making sure that before the respirator is worn, that they must first be medically evaluated using a mandatory medical questionnaire. And that's what this OSHA info sheet is. It shows what that questionnaire should be. So this is a great resource, particularly if you're going to be working with someone who's going to be doing the type of medical evaluations that are needed in this respiratory protection program. So another requirement that's on that long list that was at the beginning is the respirator fit testing. And the individual must be fit tested with the same brand, model, and size that they will be using in their environment. And they should be fit tested before the first use of that respirator. Here's a good picture of respiratory fit testing. To be perfectly honest, this is my son-in-law, and he was my guide to stage this great picture, although he does need to wear respiratory protection in his work as well. And then I found a great resource too out there. It's a CDC resource. It talks very clearly about fit testing. Clickable link for you. It's also listed in the resources at the end of this presentation. Another requirement is training. So the OSHA standard requires the employer to provide effective training to employees who are required to use respirators. And this training must be comprehensive, understandable, and we need to do that annually or more often if necessary. And so here's a list of times when it would be when the training would need to be updated before annually. Okay, there might be change in the workplace. That can happen. Maybe inadequacies in the employee's knowledge of the use of respiratory protection or the respirator. Then we understand maybe they didn't retain what we told them. Maybe you're watching them do their job and you're like, I think they need to have a little additional training. And maybe other situations that may arise to make sure we have a safe respirator use. Sometimes people have medical conditions, or maybe they have lost weight, gained weight, had to have dentures, maybe some surgery to their face, so there's a change in size and shape, or maybe you've just changed your work environment. Now, the Department of Labor OSHA Respiratory Protection Training Requirements video is good. I believe it's about, 7 minutes. Yeah, about 7 minutes. So you'll be able to click to that and look at that, and you'll get a good idea of what this training should entail. Also, I think this one's going to play. I'm going to just stop it for right now. So part of this training, looks like it was just going to play. So anyway, we're not going to play it during my presentation, but there you go. There's that video. It looks like it plays automatically as we move forward to the presentation. So take some time to take a look at that. Another requirement is maintenance of those respirators. It really doesn't do any good for you to decide which respirators should be used, fit tested, and then do training, but then we don't teach anybody how to take care of their respirator. They just throw it in the corner. They maybe put it in their equipment. They don't store it properly. They don't clean it properly. So here's a list of things that we need to make sure that individuals are doing to make sure that the respirator maintenance is part of the overall program. There's manufacturer's instructions that can be helpful. So this is important not only for the respirators, but also to know when to change filters and know when they should be disposed of. So this is an important part of this requirement, which is maintenance. There's a fun little motion graphic that our organization put together, and it is talking about agriculture, but all the information in it is very applicable to matter which type of occupation you're in, and it's just talking about the importance of proper respiratory storage. So hey, take a look at that too. I think it's going to do a play a little bit here, and so I'm going to let it play just for maybe a break for you from listening to me.
Respirators are a common type of protective equipment used in agriculture. It is important to store your protective equipment when not in use to extend its lifetime. For example, if respirators are not stored properly, they may not function properly. Similar to what you see on labeled packed foods at your grocery store, there is also a shelf life for respirators. This use-by date can be found on the storage box. Storing respirators in extreme temperatures leads to degraded parts, like loosened face straps or nose clips. An obvious sign of degradation is discoloration of the respirator's material. It is a good idea to store respirators in locations where the temperature can stay between 32 and 85 degrees Fahrenheit. Like most safety equipment, the sun's rays may damage your respirator. It is best stored indoors. If your respirator can be reused, develop a good habit of cleaning all the parts after use. All you need is a little soap and water. Dry it before storing. Respirators should be stored in sturdy, airtight containers, like a plastic bag or the bag provided by the manufacturer. It is helpful to have a designated clean storage space for your protective equipment to reduce risk of contamination. If you don't want it on your face, then you don't want it on your equipment. Keep the respirator in a location where it is not crushed by heavier items, such as equipment. Following these tips will ensure your respirator stays in good condition.
So the entirety of that little short motion graphic, I believe is like 2 minutes and 40 seconds. I played most of it for you, but take a look at that and feel free to use that at any time if you think that would be helpful to you when you're helping with respiratory programs or just helping with respirator fit testing and all of those types of important information we're trying to get out to the individuals using them. Another requirement in the list is evaluation. Evaluations of the workplace must be conducted annually or as necessary to ensure that the effective implementation of the program. And review that program periodically to make sure it's running properly. To have a program but not pay any attention to how effective it is not good. So employees required to use respirators must be consulted. We must be asked them, is this working for you? Does the respirators fitting you? Do you have any ongoing questions? Are you concerned about your work environment? So there really is an important role for the employer to reach out to the employees or the individuals wearing respirators. Sometimes, no matter how good a job you do, they still find them uncomfortable. They may not be willing to use them. So it's our job to make sure we're evaluating our program. And then record keeping. Having worked with OSHA over the years during some Susan Harwood training grants and just in general to make sure we're providing good information, record keeping really does help the employer stay out of any situations where they might be cited if they're inspected. It doesn't do any good to be doing a really good job with your respiratory program if you're not tracking it. For example, if your employees are supposed to wash their respirators every time they use them and store them correctly, and you have a form that they're supposed to check that off, if nobody's checking the form while they're checking it off, then we have not been doing our due diligence to make sure whatever we have in place is working. And that is perhaps where a citing may happen. Even though you're doing a good job, you haven't documented it. Plus, you must maintain all of these medical evaluations. You must maintain record of fit testing. I know during COVID there were some issues with people weren't able to be fit tested because it just wasn't available or it wasn't appropriate based on the exposures. So there were ways that companies could document that with a plan to achieve that at a later date. And so those are some things that we would also want to document. So there's an example here of documentation and record keeping, and that would be in a respiratory protection program. Like I said at the beginning, there's some templates out there that people can take a look at to make sure that we're following what we're supposed to do based on this OSHA regulation. So now how does this work in practice? So we have a whole list of things, the key requirements of a respiratory protection program, which include all of the things that we just reviewed in a little bit of detail. And so really it relies on the roles and responsibilities for each thing that are listed in scope of practice. Written programs can be done by an administrator or somebody within the organization or company. Hazard identification and risk assessment many times relies on the ability to get those to be able to do what you do as an industrial hygienist and really be able to do the adequate testing or the right testing based on the hazard. Selection of respirators. Now that's something I do. That's something I'm experienced in. Medical screening. I can do many aspects of that until they have to have a screening or medical evaluation by a healthcare provider such as a physician. Fit testing. I can do fit testing. I can do training. I can assist with a maintenance program. I can help somebody understand evaluation, but I can't evaluate at that particular organization or company. And record keeping. So many pieces of this different people need to be involved with. So here's a list of resources. These are out there on the canvas where you have all of the other resources related to this program. These are some of my favorite and the ones that I think will be helpful to you. Also, here's contact information for myself. This is my number. This is my email address, if that can be helpful to you. Also, like to point you to Risto, and he also has his cell phone listed in his email address. So once again, it's been great to meet you like this. And I hope you have a good rest of your week. And I'll see you again for week 15 lecture on respirators, I believe it is.